Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of our first day at our 2021 Blockchain for Europe Summit. I hope you enjoyed the first half of the first day already. We start with a very interesting panel on interoperability. And before I hand over to our moderator, Ian Taylor, I just would like you to also have a look at our Twitter account, or if you want to retweet anything, please use the hashtag BC4EU Summit 2021, or follow us on Twitter and retweet, reshare our comments of our distinguished speaker. And on this note, please enjoy the second half of our first day. And I'm handing over to Ian. Ian, the panel and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this interesting panel titled Interoperability, Connecting the Old and the New World in a Standardized Way. Today, we're honored to have four distinguished guests, speakers from a variety of industry disciplines, including native blockchains, traditional industry, and global policy arena. Blockchain technology, by its very nature, is premised on peer-to-peer interactions around shared distributed ledgers. This makes a transformation from a siloed and fragmented approach to end-to-end value chain integration more attainable. However, it also means that the importance of interoperability is imperative. In its simplest form, interoperability successfully allows the user to trust that I know what I see is what you also see. The trust of the data, whether a public blockchain with no single controlling entity or private or enterprise blockchain with a specifically selected group of entities running the network, is a key value driving attribute of blockchains as a way of recording, storing, and sharing data. On our panel today, we look at existing architectures and how blockchains could possibly replace traditional infrastructure, or will we see a so-called hybrid model emerge where innovative solutions will connect most types of blockchains, other DLTs, and current centralized systems. During this debate, we'll discuss the current and traditional aspects of interoperability and some of the challenges these may bring. We will seek to understand how governments can support and nurture blockchain interoperability. And finally, we'll discuss new trends in interoperability across blockchains, or so-called blockchains of blockchains. I welcome our panel. I'll introduce myself and then invite our distinguished guests to introduce themselves. As Robert said, my name's Ian Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Crypto UK. We're the UK's trade body for the crypto and blockchain industry. Our mission is to advocate and educate, thus ensuring a fair, balanced, and proportionate approach to regulating our industry. So let me introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. First, over to Jens Hermann, who's a senior expert for corporate strategy at Deutsche Telekom.
Yeah, hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Yeah, I'm Jens. I'm working for the group strategy department of Deutsche Telekom and looking also mainly on blockchain related topics. So that's why I'm here and share some of our insights.
Thanks, Jens. Caroline Malcolm from OECD is blockchain and tax lead.
Hi, Ian, and hi, everybody. It's really great to be here and to be amongst such a fantastic panel. Yes, so I work relating to blockchain and tax at the OECD, and of course, founder of the OECD's Global Blockchain Policy Center, which covers a very broad range of work. So hoping to delve into a little bit some of that previous work I've been leading, and much more recently, some of the work on tax as well. Thanks, Ian.
And now let's introduce Siddharth Singhal, who's a director of enterprise at Parity.
Hi, everyone, and hi, and a pleasure to be on the panel today. I am part of Parity and responsible more for the enterprise side of things. As Ian was probably alluded to, we are popularly known as the blockchain of blockchains. Looking forward to the panel and diving deep into the interoperability. Thanks.
And over to Philip von Stip-Rakowski, who's a technical lead at Nimik.
Hi, Ian, and hi, everyone. My name is Philip von Stip-Rakowski. I'm the tech lead at the Nimik project. And at Nimik, we are building cryptocurrency designed for humans. So we're trying to bridge the gap between obscure and cryptic cryptocurrencies and the humans, and try to build usable decentralized systems. And looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, thank you to our panelists for the intros. The way we'll structure this debate is we'll ask a question to each of our panelists and then invite other panelists to provide some additional color. And we welcome any of the attendees to ask questions within the chat on the platform they're using. We'll pick them up as we go through the debate. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. All right, so without any further ado, let me position the first question to Jens. So at Deutsche Telekom, we know this is the largest telecommunications company in Europe with over 100 billion in annual revenues. One would imagine the tech spend at Deutsche Telekom to be in the many millions, perhaps even the billions on an annual basis. So Jens, could you give us a sense of the existing strategies that Deutsche use to record, store and share data, perhaps focusing your answer specifically on how your company achieves interoperability across its many partners and I assume many thousands of stakeholders. And furthermore, what current exciting projects are you working on that looks at blockchains and the benefits that they offer in terms of interoperability, for example?
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, very, very great question. Very, very good question. So in general, yes, absolutely right. So DT is a very large company and we need to handle actually a lot of data. In general, really, I mean, we distinguish data into several classes, like user data or data from our suppliers, like billing information, usage information, for example, streaming information and streaming network data that is going through our network. But also things like we know information, calling, data information, and so on. Also what's happening in our backbone when we interconnect several partners to our network. A lot of data is being transferred. So thanks to the industry bodies the telecommunication segment has, a lot of the working is standardized, for example, on the roaming side, on the voice side, on the messaging side, but also on the internet side. A lot of this is standardized in a way that data exchange is possible and doable. But nevertheless, I mean, there are things like, for example, when you exchange network information, SMS information with certain carriers, you can agree on, I mean, who is responsible for doing clearing and settlement of such information. And here it comes interesting, specifically for roaming. Like roaming, imagine you're traveling, you're in a different country and you're roaming. All of this information needs to be handled by the home operator, but also by the visiting operator and so on. And so a lot of data is going here and there, and you need to have someone who is making sure that information is being collected, how much data is being consumed, and the pricing information is accurate, right? That if you bill your customer later on. So for these kind of things, we rely on service providers who are doing that, like clearinghouse providers. The interesting thing is, with so much information that you have, you can also create certain value. And value really here we are driving into is what kind of things you can automate because of the information, the data you have. And specifically on the roaming side, a lot happened lately. In 2019, Deutsche Telekom, together with other operators, we invested into a company called ClearX. And what they're doing is clearing and settlement automation in a big blockchain network. And this is really interesting because currently how we do this in terms of how to handle contracts between operators, these are more or less paper contracts in the industry even, right? The whole industry is relying on that or used to rely on that. But thanks to Clear and the development there, now we are operating together with Clear, the biggest roaming blockchain network out there with so many operators being part of that and now making sure that for roaming discounts, roaming agreements, things like that, that you automate the clearing and settlement process. And even with smart contracts, you can trigger certain actions out of that. Let's say issue payments, issue billing information, and so on. So that's very interesting what's happening here. And this is really the old and the new world. The old world was working fine, but still it took a lot of time to, let's say, embed changes, implement changes, things like that. Now with a blockchain-based environment, such information, such exchange is done much faster, and it gives more flexibility at the end on the operator side to focus on use cases that you can build around that, and so on. That was for us really a big learning curve, and also for the industry of what blockchain is able to do in such a specific sector. The second one was our recent investment into Chelo. Really interesting because you have a network out there that allows you to send money, so in this case stable coins, to a phone number. So that was for us basically a perfect match, and seeing, hey, this is really interesting because what this can enable for a user base on a traditional network or phone environment is really sending money now across borders with really low transfer fees, things like that. So this is really interesting, and again from a standardized way, because the overall network infrastructure, the overall network chain info this is standardized. But now to make a blockchain use case out of that and to send money across borders, this is really interesting. Plus, we also in this network, we will run a validator. So we are making sure that all the transaction, or we are part of a validator group, so to say, making sure that these transactions are being validated. And this is infrastructure. This is standard infrastructure. This is cloud infrastructure. We run here our own data center, where we're running the node on the validators of the Clear blockchain. And this is basically where us as telcos, but also other infrastructure providers in the IT environment can really make a difference. What I mean by that is we're decentralizing the way you transfer assets across the globe. And that's interesting. And this is a pure telco use case for us, because sending money to a phone number, that's amazing, right? I mean, that's nice, and it can enable so many extra functions. Because specifically, when you're seeing this in more in a B2B environment, because also big companies, us as a telco, other telcos as well, or even partners out there, we transfer money globally. So now just imagine you would have a stable coin allowing you to transfer for the service you have with your partners, with your customers, with your suppliers in a digital way, without fees for international bank wires, without fees because the euro or the dollar is going up and down, things like that. So for the industry, that could really enable interesting use cases, also the machine-to-machine use cases. And yeah, this is something we're really looking into to figure out, what is the impact here for us, the strategic impact for us, and how can we be part of that and participate from the development.
Thank you, Jens. That's really interesting, and I'll just pick up on, you mentioned standardization in the traditional infrastructure stack is really important for the interconnection of your business. And I like the use case you provided around sending a stable token to a telephone number. That really does help solve for cross-border payments and remove the frictions that the current system has. And also regarding settlement, and I'll invite some other folks on the panel to mention any other interesting areas that Jens brought up. I like the idea that blockchain, when it comes to settlement of financial transactions that you talked about, can reduce the time of settlement, which is across borders is standard T+2. So 2 days, and we talk about, and there's lots of projects out there. I mentioned One Paxos, for example, are looking to reduce this to T0, well, instantaneous settlement on blockchain. So yeah, there's some really interesting use cases that are in play right now.
Exactly. So this is really the interesting part, to really reduce the time for these kind of transactions, but also reduce the possibility to enable transaction not only between telcos as such, but also between different parties. Because just imagine now, let's take the use case. You're traveling, you're sending SMS, or you're watching a movie, things like that. These kind of transactions can also be automated and with smart contracts directly between the partner and the operator, and even handled through the end customer. So this is really, it enabled so much new use cases. Yeah.
Thanks, Jens. Okay, let's move on to our second question now, which I'm going to pose to Philippe at Nimik. So, as we know, Nimik is a native blockchain whose mission from day one is to enhance interoperability. Nimik is interesting as it's a browser-based blockchain, which is written in JavaScript, and because of this, the complete blockchain runs in the browser. So, Philip, can you talk about some of the problems that Nimik is trying to solve in terms of payments and simplifying sending monies across borders to the previous discussion, and how it connects existing payments architecture with new cryptocurrency blockchain-based infrastructure?
Sure, thank you. I hope you can understand me well, because my internet connection is breaking up a little bit at this time. But I'll just go from here, and you can stop me if there are any issues. Okay, so yeah, here at Nimik, we, as I said initially, we try to build cryptocurrency for humans to make decentralized systems more usable. One issue that we see today with cryptocurrencies is that they are inherently difficult to use, and many users actually resort to centralized solutions that make it more convenient and more easier for them to cryptocurrencies. But of course, unfortunately, by doing so, they sacrifice a lot of the nice properties that we get from crypto, one most notably self-custody. And our mission is to basically compete with these centralized services on a usability level without actually compromising on the decentralization of the underlying technology. So we really want to maintain all the nice decentralization properties that we have in crypto, and not take any centralized shortcuts, and really try to enable average users, average humans to use cryptocurrencies the way they were intended to be used. And that's what we are working on, to remove these barriers, to make crypto more accessible, to make crypto maybe even more interoperable with humans. And one of the our focus that we have here at Nimik is payments, crypto payments. We really trying to get people to enable people to actually pay with cryptocurrencies, ideally at any point of sale, or any payment that you can imagine, any real world payment. And on the one hand, what we do is we provide our own layer one technology. We have our own blockchain that we built and designed from scratch. And for payments, we of course need a scalable and very cheap layer one tech that enables this payment use case and all the applications that we want to build on top. And also this blockchain, or this layer one tech that we are designing, is built with usability in mind. So one example of that would be that the blockchain is actually, the full blockchain can actually run in a browser. So all a user needs to do is basically open up a web page, and the client that runs in the browser will connect to the blockchain directly without using any intermediaries, without any proxies or gateway nodes that are required to actually get access to the network. And that way we get an actual decentralized client running in the browser without having the user download or install anything. So that was one of the ideas behind having a blockchain that works in the browser. But besides this, the blockchain itself, or the layer one tech itself, we are also building and developing usable applications on top of that tech, and try to solve real pain points when it comes to actually using crypto. So we don't only want to provide the blockchain tech itself, but we also want to provide the full round trip. So get it, hold it, spend it, basically. How do I get in and out of crypto if I have no crypto at all? If I'm coming from the fiat world, how do I get in and out? How do I hold it in a self-custodial way? And also how do I spend it at the end of the day, and can buy real world products with my crypto? And what I want to focus on here today as part of this panel is basically our solution, or one of the approaches that we are pursuing as to how do I actually get crypto with fiat, or how do I exchange between crypto and fiat, so the old and the new world, in a way where where I'm not relying on a centralized party to facilitate that exchange, which is currently the de facto way to get in and out of crypto, right? On your Coinbase, on your Kraken, that's basically the way that users are buying crypto from fiat nowadays. And so centralized exchanges, they support fiat. That's currently the way that it's being done. But also there's of course a bunch of decentralized exchanges that have better properties than centralized exchanges, you know, from a crypto point of view. But unfortunately, decentralized exchanges nowadays, they don't really support fiat. But what they do, and what we find a lot in DEXs, is that they basically enable exchange between crypto assets that also live on different ledgers, right? So of course we have DEXs that basically just stay on one ledger, do ERC20 to ERC20 exchange on Ethereum, for example. But there are also a number of established techniques that allow exchange across different ledgers, and that's basically an interoperability a problem within the crypto space itself. So how do I allow this decentralized exchange between different ledgers? And there are plenty of ways to do that, and I'm sure we're also going to hear some more later in this panel. But the one that we focused on are cross-chain atomic swaps. And the nice thing about cross-chain atomic swaps is that they just rely on one simple payment, one simple primitive, a programmable escrow, or a conditional payment, so to say. In technical terms, a hash time lock contract, which is a smart contract that is supported by a number of blockchains. And this very primitive allows exchange between two compatible blockchains, or makes those blockchains interoperable, without actually requiring, you know, knowledge of the interoperable part. So I can basically swap between any two blockchains that support this conditional payment primitive, and I don't actually have to connect them in an explicit way. So if I want to swap between Bitcoin and Ethereum don't need to know about each other, even though they are interoperable. Right? And what we did is basically the key idea was to take this established mechanism, which already works well in a decentralized exchange setting in the crypto space, and transfer this interoperability mechanism back to the fiat off-chain world. So in a sense, to build a interoperability layer between the crypto world and the fiat world, where we sort of wrap the existing infrastructure that exists in the fiat world today, and sort of simulate you know, the behavior of a blockchain system on top of that existing infrastructure, without actually introducing a blockchain. So it is not a revolution of how fiat payment work, but it's basically a retrofit to the existing system to make it compatible with the blockchain world in a most lightweight way, because you know, you can basically use this and set this up without changing your underlying infrastructure. And so ultimately, this compatibility layer makes off-chain assets behave as if they were token on a blockchain. And with that mechanism, it allows us to basically plug in off-chain assets into the existing decentralized exchange infrastructure. So the idea is that what you could traditionally do crypto to crypto, you can now do crypto to fiat. And so we call our scheme Nimik Oasis, the Open Asset Swap Interaction Scheme. And what we've basically done with that scheme is to kind of specify an API or a protocol that trusted financial institutions can implement, or basically any sort of trusted entity that can hold and transfer an asset that we want to connect to this compatibility layer. And this scheme sort of, you know, is kind of a proposal on how you know, such an interface could look like. And the idea is that we get, you know, as many banks or financial institutions to implement this scheme, such that we are not relying on a single bank offering the scheme, but have ideally like a multitude of banks and escrow agents that the user can choose from to actually make it decentralized. Yeah, I mentioned that the scheme works on cross-chain atomic swaps. I'm not going to go into the technical details, see how that works, but the core idea is basically to have, instead of having like one centralized exchange that basically takes custody of all the assets that are being exchanged. If we have two parties that want to do an exchange, they don't trust each other. Essentially, the idea is to basically set up two escrows. Every party, both parties pay their funds into those two escrows, and the escrows are set up in a way, or the conditions of the escrows are set up in a way that basically they both release the funds under the same condition, which kind of allows to atomically release either both funds or none of those funds without actually giving them to one single escrow. Yeah, as I mentioned, the only thing that we need is basically this conditional payment primitive, basically a payment that will only be forwarded to the designated recipient once a particular condition is met. And the key, the idea behind the scheme is that, or one of the ideas is that it basically retains the current trust model that we have. So basically, if we think about the fiat world as a, also as a decentralized ledger, maybe, then we can think of it as a sharded proof of authority kind of blockchain where individual banks have parts of the ledger and they can basically modify that ledger because they are trusted. And we are pushing basically the enforcement of this conditional payment, or we're pushing that escrow functionality to the banks, which are of course trusted entities in the fiat system. So we are basically in line with the current trust model, but we are also not improving on it. And another nice property is that it's basically completely blockchain or crypto agnostic. So we are only adding basically this conditional payment functionality to fiat by having a bank offer that functionality. And that way we are already interoperable with crypto without actually doing anything with crypto, right? So the provider of that interface will never have to connect to a blockchain or even know anything about a blockchain. It's really just a very simple primitive that stays completely within the fiat world. And that already basically gives us interoperability with any kind of blockchain that has the same payment primitive. So, so what can we do with it? So basically, this whole thing is a kind of a building block for DeFi apps. So for example, one prominent use case would be fiat on-off ramps. So for example, we have in the Nimik wallet, which is a self-custodial browser wallet, we've integrated a way for a user to buy and sell crypto just by sending a SEPA instant transaction to our partner bank that is offering the service. And a user can basically, without any registration, buy crypto from their bank account using a non-custodial exchange scheme in under 5 minutes without any registration or anything. And selling works the same way. But we are also envisioning this to be, of course, integrated into DEXs, but we can also imagine OTC desks using this, or we could even have a remittance service that connects several instances of this scheme that in banks or financial institutions around the world, and can basically do atomic swaps in between those banks and entities. Yeah, and we have basically implemented this already. We have partnered with a German 1031 bank to offer this service to European customers. And all it requires is right now is a SEPA instant capable bank account. This is the infrastructure that we have built this on top of. And yeah, we have done several months of open beta, and the system is working really well. And the public launch is actually right around the corner. And yeah, I think this is one of the contributions that Nimik is making in terms of interoperability and how to connect the new and the old world.
Thank you ever so much for that. That is really, really interesting. It seems that you folks at Nimik eat, live, and breathe interoperability with the work you're doing. And look, it would be remiss of me as an individual that runs a trade body not to bring in a discussion around regulation, especially around banks. We know that it's really difficult, especially in the UK, for crypto native businesses to partner with banks, even to receive basic banking services. This is a big issue for our industry. And we know, as you mentioned, that centralized exchanges are the only way to on-ramp fiat. As somebody that wants to buy crypto, decentralized exchanges offer a great amount of variety around swapping different types of assets. However, what I see you trying to solve is the bridge between the fiat world and the world of decentralized exchanges and DeFi in general, which is lacking. Naturally, stablecoins are dominating the decentralized finance space. But what can I sort of just follow up, Philip, with where do you see the sort of direction of travel with regards to such issues that are pretty big in the community that I know you'll be aware about around anti-money laundering and terrorist finance, and how governments and especially centralized authorities, intergovernmental agencies such as Financial Action Task Force are really focused on this issue of increasing flows of funds now. To quote DeFi Pulse, we're nearly at 100 billion of total value locked in or assets under management in the DeFi space. Is this something that you think you can solve, and how are you guys thinking about this?
I mean, generally, I think that public blockchains are probably good for anti-money laundering, basically. So generally, by being able to observe what's happening on the blockchain, I think that actually has great advantages in terms of tracking flows of funds and doing anti-money laundering. When we were setting up our service, we are of course also faced with these regulations. So what we are doing right now is basically we are just limiting the amounts that you can transfer through our interface when you're not registered. So we basically have this free non-KYC version, which is limited to 1,000 euros per month. And we basically have a bunch of heuristics that try to identify, as a single person and to enforce that limit. And if you want to, go beyond that limit, you will actually have to do proper KYC, and we'll do all the AML checks that are necessary. Yeah, but I also have to admit that I'm really not an expert on regulation at all, but more of a technical person. So I really cannot. I really would have to speculate how regulation and AML is going to develop. So I'm sure maybe other panelists can say more with respect to this question.
Yeah, Caroline, do you have a view as a representative that operates in the policy space as to perhaps as Philip describes a solution that provides a bridge, if you like, between the fiat and the decentralized world?
Yeah, no, Ian, it's a good question. And I think that obviously, AML KYC is one of the not just one of, I think really the first area where regulators move to sort of take action in terms of blockchain applications, quickly followed by kind of financial consumer protection issues more generally. I think, that concern about the, using applications for those purposes isn't going away anytime soon. And so finding ways, and I think one interesting development, which will also kind of, bring some light to this space. One interesting development is kind of in the CBDC space. So looking at, if countries move towards development of CBDCs, And depending on, which particular model they use, this question of KYC and ongoing AML, CFT monitoring is going to have to be solved for use in those. And that's really going to bring, I think, that challenge very much directly home, not just a concern for private sectors who at the moment sort of have this delegated responsibility for making sure that that compliance is met, but also really bring it to the forefront of concerns that governments themselves are dealing with. Again, that depends a little bit on the model. If you still have some sort of two-tier model where you're still going to source, in a sense, that responsibility for KYC, et cetera, to parties in the private sector, whether it be the traditional financial institutions or others. But I think that development, and particularly with the goal that we're hearing about quite often in terms of universal access and really finding ways to achieve that in kind of creative ways. And I think, Philip gave an example that, using thresholds, for example, to, try and have accessibility on one hand, but also balance that with, kind of what are the risks from and, you can do that in policy ways. You can also use technology. And I think Philip sort of alluded to that in terms of, you can identify different heuristics to make sure you don't have a single person with 10 accounts trying to get up to that €1,000 threshold and so forth. And I think if you see what's been done in the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank dollar, the digital dollar that's been created and is now running on a pilot basis, but a pretty broad pilot basis, they have also gone for this kind of multi-threshold model in terms of, up to a certain point, and that can be, it can be a total volume of transactions, it can be a number of transactions, et cetera, that once you hit those different thresholds, a bit like, it's a bit like PayPal, but after a certain point, you've got to kind of provide more information about who you are and so forth. So I think, look, it's not going away in terms of a policy challenge in this space. And as, the industry seeks to grow, and growth requires, institutional players, and institutional players require regulation. That's only going to get, a more and more pressing problem that needs to be solved. Even if we manage, as Philip talking about, making things like DeFi more accessible. At the moment, it's not exactly something that, most people could, feel comfortable going on and writing their own kind of, script to execute a transaction. If you are able to make that more accessible, you are going to grow the market, and therefore the kind of risk is also going to grow in turn. But Ian, if you don't mind, while I have the floor, I wanted to also, maybe we can come back to it, but I also wanted to just raise an issue, something that Jens talked about, and he spoke about kind of how in their the use of DLT in the kind of roaming space. One thing that sort of assisted there was, they had these pre-existing standards. And I think that's something that we've really seen in quite a few instances, that to move to a DLT-based system, the most effective ways have been where you have pre-existing agreement between the people in the system about, whether it be data standards or, various sort of levels of standardization. And I would love to hear even from Jens, in terms of getting that agreement of a consortium working together, how important was, having those existing those existing standards that then sort of had to be, I guess, translated into the DLT space, or was that really not a factor?
It was really mandatory even to work with these standards, right? And then to build up upon of them. What you just mentioned, Caroline, right? To create this accessibility is exactly because of that. We had this old, I would not say old ecosystem, but an ecosystem that was working. And now to extend it with new use cases, you need to, let's say, go into, at least in that case, as an example, into the crypto scene. So for me, it's always, how can you combine now the crypto environment with, let's say, the banking environment, and make sure that you also not create an ecosystem that is in parallel one, but one that enables also others to participate in that one that are not able to, let's say, accelerate that fast or to adopt that fast into a new crypto environment. This is for me the interesting one. And also for the industry in general, specifically for bigger companies, in this case like ET or others, it's really, there needs to be a bridge into the new world from the old world.
It seems to me, in my experience, with a number of initiatives going on across the Eurozone, is this is being led quite progressively by the private sector, whether it be some standards for the travel rule and FATF interface messaging standard is being led by the private sector. I know if those guys that operate in financial services, IBAN, there's a standardization project that's looking to spin up unique identifiers that are known across the trading world for crypto assets that now are coming into the institutional space. And I just wanted to flag on a really interesting point that Philip made, and you touched on as well, Caroline, regarding that the private sector and folks that are building really interesting blockchains and solutions are baking in regulatory considerations into their projects already. And this is something that in what we do as an advocacy group at Crypto UK is try and tell policymakers that the industry itself is thinking about these things, and it's really interesting that you have written a whole bunch of instructions and code to look at the limits of £1,000. And Caroline, you mentioned the sand dollar as well, and that's an interesting project. And we just saw El Salvador are going to make Bitcoin legal tender. So governments are moving in a direction, some at different speeds than others, and I think that's probably a nice segue to move into a question specifically at you, Caroline, regarding the good work that you do at the OECD. And so, for me, it's it's interesting to see how both sides of the coin, the public and the private sector, can develop and strive to encourage the development of interoperability that we know will nurture the benefits that blockchain can provide to society. So as the blockchain and tax lead at the OECD, what can you sort of speak to around initiatives that you see there between public and private sector that perhaps work together to foster collaboration, and who, in your opinion, should drive this?
That's a good question. I mean, look, it's interesting. As the founder of the Global Blockchain Policy Center at the OECD, kind of first came upon sort of interoperability as a potential issue when we created what we call the BEPAB. It's the Blockchain Expert Policy Advisory Board of the OECD, and really we brought that group together to look at what are some of the principles that you would want to consider, whether you are in the public sector, the private sector, academia, or so forth, as being important for responsible blockchain innovation and adoption. And the idea here was recognizing, innovation is being driven predominantly by the private sector in this space. And I guess the role of the public sector is to make sure, in a sense, that innovation occurs in a way which aligns with broader societal values. So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about? If you're a developer or if you're someone thinking about adopting a DLT-based system, to either replace or integrate with, an existing IT system, what are some of the things that you should be thinking about in the space? And it was in that context that, some different principles or potential principles sort of came up, and interoperability was one of them. I will say we are about to open up a public consultation on some of these different potential principles and with interoperability amongst those. But interoperability is quite interesting because we've heard about it already here in a number of different ways. And I guess, first of all, from a policy perspective, the question is, well, is interoperability important, and why is it important? And then secondly, what sort of interoperability are we actually talking about here? Because, Jens spoke about, well, interoperability, the importance of creating that bridge. So between legacy systems or existing systems or other technology systems and DLT-based systems. As Philip was talking, really more, between the kind of, yes, the old world, and the new, the fiat and the kind of digital currency world, but also once you're in that digital currency world, how do those different, systems sort of talk to each other? And that's just in the finance space. And so with interoperability, you know, what sort of interoperability are we talking about? And part of that is thinking about, like, why is interoperability important? Is it important because we want to ensure that customers can easily port between one service provider and another, and they can take all their data, for example, and move it from one system to another, or they can switch accounts or switch ledgers and so forth like this? Is that the really objective? Or is the objective about making sure you have standards so that you keep market openness and promote competition and lower the barriers for entry for new market, you know, for new people coming into the market, so that you don't have some of the sort of closed garden structures that you see, you know, that have really occurred with kind of the sort of the internet that we have today. So thinking about why is interoperability important and what are we really trying to achieve with interoperability is sort of where the kind of the discussion starts for us. And that's why, you know, we want to understand, and also, you know, we know that interoperability can be achieved in lots of different ways. You can have standards, so things can talk more directly to each other, or you can have people creating services which, you know, operate and possibly quite automatically, you know, to talk as the kind of intermediary, even if it's an automated intermediary between different systems. So there are different ways to sort of to get to that end goal. But understanding why you think interoperability is important and what you're trying to achieve when you talk about interoperability is something that, you know, the OECD has been exploring. As I said, we will be starting a public consultation there. But I think, you know, in terms of who's responsible, I don't know that it really falls on any one player. Look, I think that's probably true in general, but it's probably particularly true in the distributed space. And that's because unlike, you know, and if I talk about the very decentralized systems, we know most of the products, you know, we're seeing today tend to be more centralized, particularly kind of enterprise solutions. But if we think about the really kind of fully decentralized, you know, DeFi products, for example, you don't have that one person that you can say, well, you're responsible for doing this. So it's really then about, and if you think back to some of the early thinking, well, early in the 2000s around the internet, you know, this idea of kind of coder's law, and how do you, in a system where, you know, our traditional legal approach of putting responsibility on one person for ensuring interoperability or for doing whatever it is that they're meant to be doing, complying with the travel rule and so forth, where you don't have that, how can you create, you know, norms, you know, architecture, market kind of demand, which seeks to pursue those kind of values that we think as a society are quite important. So what are those kind of alternative methods, or kind of mechanisms that you can use to achieve those policy objectives, which go beyond just kind of laws and regulations, which in the decentralized space are not necessarily going to be as effective as you might. And I think, yeah, maybe just to finish, the other thing I think is quite important, and you mentioned it just before, is, you know, there is a desire, particularly if you want to bring in kind of, you know, open up the market, bring in institutional players, regulation and compliance is going to be really important to attract those players. So how, you know, when you're doing that, how can you really, you know, make sure that that is as accessible as possible, and to do that in a way that, as I said, there's not necessarily the lock-in that you might get in other more traditional systems. But hopefully that answers your question, at least in part.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you so much, Caroline. You raised some really interesting topics I wanted to throw into the ring for some of the other panelists, especially around the way that you are looking at interoperability in terms of what's the objective. Now, let me
I could pick that up probably, as in,
please do.
So, Caroline, as in, you touched on probably like the service aspect of it. Like, so you mentioned, like, be it from a regulatory aspect, like, or a standardization aspect, which comes first, right? Is it a standard or a service which probably gets enough adoption, and then that kind of becomes a de facto standard? So I think as a kind of technical service provider, or like Parity would want to say that the infrastructure that we are building hopefully becomes a service that people want to use in the community, right? And so we're doing a bunch of different things around interoperability, and like just to answer in terms of like the tools available for regulators, and we work with many NGOs which are actually like solutions which are live across doing transactions for 100,000 refugees a day just for their livelihood, everything happening via blockchain systems, or really enterprises thinking about architecting their kind of future of money, future of payments. So we offer services or like products or platforms, you can call them, which could have the traditional policies or be it regulatory compliances being represented via on-chain or off-chain governances, but then also higher order. So existing IT infrastructure that exists, so compliance processes that exist could be represented then on a mixture of different technologies, and then that could be customized, right? So that, I guess, like is where I think we come from. But on the more distributed sense, and then we would like to believe that like Polkadot or our network does represent the more distributed side of things, and we don't think like we are centralized by any sense, but that there then are multiple initiatives of how we are trying to bridge multiple different chains or assets and stuff like that, right? So we also have a tool or a framework called Substrate, which helps people build their own chains, and probably Philip can talk about later like how difficult is it to build a layer one. The team at Parity has built a few different blockchains, Ethereum being one of them, and that's why we created Substrate, which helps people build their own blockchain, be it private or permissioned or public one, and then Polkadot helps connect all those chains, right? For the non-substrate based chains, we then have a concept of like bridge palettes, which then bridge those different chains to each other and help relay kind of messages between each other. On the kind of token swap side, of course, those can be implemented at a higher order level, as kind of Philip was alluding to. There are multiple other initiatives, and then we try to kind of support that natively as well. There's also like a way for us, and this has been done, I think, on Ethereum, EOS, Tezos as well, like to support smart contract interoperability, essentially. So smart contract based chains could then be interoperated with each other. I'll kind of stop there.
Thank you, Siddharth. And I was just thinking to myself about the frictions really with regards to vendors considering interoperability. It's really like, as especially Philip and Siddharth that are working in the space building blockchains, it's aligning incentives. What incentives could be offered to vendors or anybody building any kind of solution that the users and the vendors work more closely in finding ways to enable interoperability. I was thinking perhaps problems exist as folks are focused more on what's best for them, given the particular use case they're looking to address. What incentives can we perhaps consider that ensure interoperability is not second to this primary objective?
Then I could probably start. So on our end, there are a few things that we have thought about. So among building layer ones or building your own blockchains, like there are only finite number of resources depending on like if you go for either proof of work or any other kind of consensus algorithms. And we have tried to create what is something called as like a shared pool of security. So essentially, even though you have your own blockchain, if you are on the Polkadot network, there's a shared security pool. So you don't necessarily need to go and kind of compete on that basis with other blockchains out there. So that's one. And the second thing which comes to mind is kind of common good parachains, which we've just announced recently a few weeks back. And these are shared public utilities across different chains. So one of the more recent announcements in that, or kind of our first parachain candidate is an asset-based chain. So the only purpose that chain solves is issuing, minting, and burning assets. So what we do foresee is a bunch of different stable coins or other crypto assets or CBDCs being represented there, and the only function that this chain will perform is issuing, minting, and burning assets, and then various other chains will free up their bandwidth, and they'll not need to necessarily perform this function, because then they can rely on this public utility chain to do that.
Thanks. So that sort of leads nicely into a question I have specifically for you. But just before we move away from the discussion around sort of how the public sector can support the private sector, just regarding your public consultation, Caroline, when can we see that, and how can people get involved if they want to? And we urge as many people in the community to take part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we hope to put that out in the next week or two, certainly before the summer, and that will be open for a number of weeks to try and attract as much interest as possible. Of course, just on the OECD website, we'll also be sort of promoting it through social and through our networks as well. So no, fully would certainly appreciate as much input there as possible. As I said, I mean, one focuses on interoperability. You know, there are some other ideas in there, but also to hear, you know, maybe things that the people we've already spoken to haven't thought about, you know, as our group sort of contains a mixture of government, of private sector, academia, and tries to be as global as possible. But certainly, you know, there's a lot of kind of people doing a lot of thinking in this space. And I think that idea that we're trying to do is, you know, we've seen what happens, and you spoke about this, where you're trying to kind of retrofit regulations onto products that have already been developed. You know, if we think of the travel rule, for example, so trying to make that fit on crypto, which is already out in the world, is very, very difficult. So by trying to perhaps also help people think about what are general principles that are important, it might help to build in the future regulatory compliant products, which, not just about sort of regulation, but also kind of, as I said, some of these broader principles, so that they are sort of aligned with where kind of thinking is going in this space. And as I said, hopefully that moves, allows the move to greater adoption in turn.
Yeah, just before we move on to talk more about Polkadot, there's a number of discussions that we have with industry, and we feed this back to government agencies, especially around, we could see a future where, the customer due diligence is baked into the token using zero knowledge proofs, thus protecting privacy. We know a whole bunch of great work and development is happening in cryptography based on, for really now, cryptography is in the mainstream and not so much of a dark corner of academics and a few folk doing number theory at university and spinning up RSA. So let me just now move to a layer one solution called Polkadot, which I'm sure most of our listeners have heard about. Let me give an introduction for those that perhaps don't know. This is a cutting edge decentralized layer one solution that's a so-called Ethereum killer. Although I personally see a future where many chains will exist, but solving for some scalability issues. And we can say that Polkadot, along with Tezos and other chains, are being termed the blockchains for blockchains, as Siddharth has already explained, which feeds into this interoperability, which Philip also spoke about, using one of the first use cases for different chains to talk to each other via atomic swaps. And there's a number of questions from the audience that we'll get to in a moment. So thank you for that. For me, token exchange is arguably no longer the full scope of blockchain interoperability. Instead, various approaches have emerged in the last few years. We know our industry is very dynamic. Yeah, many of these have been focused on the blockchain interoperability. Whether we've seen hybrid solutions, connectors, bridges, which allow cross-chain communication. So as I know you've already sort of given a basic introduction to Polkadot, and you represent Parity on the enterprise side, why don't you perhaps tell us, what's going on? And you talked about the substrate, which allows people to build in a nice ecosystem blockchain that connects to all the other blockchains, but perhaps give us some examples regarding the recent developments of the parachain rollout. What projects are going live soon or being built at the moment, and what are the sort of the decentralized dApps use cases that you're seeing yourself, both in the enterprise space and the non-enterprise space?
Sure, definitely. Thanks, Ian, for that overview. As in, there's a lot of work going on, right? Like, and I have to say, like, we have been a little bit more crypto native or a little bit more decentralized than enterprise. That's how I guess the tech stack that we represent, and that naturally kind of attracts a certain type of deployment, for lack of a better word. So that there are over 400 plus teams that we know of that have been building on the platform and are live. Of course, that then represents a variety of solutions around DeFi, around identity, around IoT, smart contracts, healthcare, supply chain, trade finance. I think we have a healthy mix globally as well. Of course, there are some themes which are more popular than the others. So DeFi, NFT, identity being kind of some of the themes where more traction is there or more teams are building. And then, of course, there's enterprise side. I think I alluded to earlier, like we have NGOs which have been live for a few years, and then there are a lot of enterprises as well that we're currently in discussion with. As you mentioned, parachains auctions are going live soon. So we have something called Kusama, which is a canary network of Polkadot, and so auctions on Kusama are going live anytime next week, I assume. Just kind of finalizing. And there are, I think we've planned for 5 auctions, one after the other, and some promising teams are lining up for gathering their KSM and DOT tokens to kind of compete with each other on these auctions. So exciting times.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting next few months, and I have a wrap-up question regarding how our panelists see the future. But we're kind of coming into the last 10 minutes now, so we've got some questions that I'm just going to pull up here. So thank you so much to our attendees. First question for Philip, and thank you, Janice, for this. Atomic swaps have limits regarding hash algorithm. What are your thoughts on Aphelion algorithm, excuse my pronunciation, that proposes interoperability on blockchain level between any public and private chains?
Okay, well, certainly hash timer contracts aren't like the perfect primitive. I mean, it's been around for quite a while, and there are some drawbacks to it, but it is an established interoperability primitive. So this was basically the first mechanism that we adopted for our open asset swap interaction scheme. But generally, we are not limiting this scheme to only using hash timer contracts as a means of exchange. But it is certainly within the scope of the scheme to add other mechanisms or other primitives to the scheme to open up or to be even more interoperable or have more interoperability with other chains that, for example, don't support hash timer contracts. With respect to the Aphelion algorithm, I'm actually not familiar with that particular algorithm. But so I cannot really speak to whether that would be a suitable way to look at or for a suitable interoperability way that we could include in Oasis. But as I said, we are not limited to HTLCs, and maybe Aphelion could be an interesting option to look at to have a different mechanism that we can integrate into Oasis.
Thanks, Philip. And you have another one. You're very popular today. People love the work you're doing at Nimik. Is it possible for a bank to use a Uniswap pool? This is a liquidity pool on Uniswap as a source of liquidity for a fiat/ERC20 exchange via Nimik or Oasis? So final part of this question, can you buy an ERC20 token via your bank account?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so providing liquidity is not part of Oasis, right? Oasis is really just the basic primitive that enables the interoperability. And for our solutions, we have built our own liquidity provider on top of Oasis in order to enable users to purchase and sell cryptocurrencies at any time, so that there's always liquidity. So what tokens or what coins you can actually buy via Oasis really depends on, you know, what your liquidity provider actually provides. Or I mean, there can also be a number of different liquidity providers that make use of Oasis, since it's a completely open technology. Anyone can basically use Oasis as a building block for their service. So it should be perfectly possible to build a liquidity provider for ERC20 tokens. Whether that is actually whether we're actually able to model that as a Uniswap pool, I'm not certain at this time. I would have to look into that to assess the technical feasibility of that particular idea. But generally, Oasis can be used for any sort of exchange between fiat and any token, as long as someone actually, you know, builds a liquidity provider for that particular asset that we want to swap with fiat.
Thanks, Philip. Just another question for you, if I may.
Sure.
Whether you better answer this, what will the future fee level for Oasis Infra as a massive ramp enabler into stablecoin will be?
Okay, so for our first Oasis instance that we are offering with 1031 Bank, we have a 1% fee on all Oasis transfers. But of course, the scheme doesn't really dictate what the fees are or what the fees should be. So any Oasis provider is basically completely free to choose their own, you know, fees that they want to take for the service. And there's certainly also the will to kind of bring these fees down to basically a level that kind of just covers the cost and to really offer a low cost bridge between fiat and crypto, also when it comes to onboarding into stable coins, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
So right now, 1%.
1%. And one would assume that that's much more competitive than some of the fees we see for transferring fees cross-border. And that's one of the great use cases for the industry in terms of being able to send funds cheaply and seamlessly. Another question here for you, Philip. Do you know when it will be possible to register as a power user for Oasis?
So we are right now building the KYC portion for the power user onboarding. In our current hackathon, that's basically what's being worked on. And so we are right now in the implementation phase. So it's probably going to be a couple of more weeks, maybe a few months, until we have the power user feature for Oasis live. But this is what we are working on right now.
Thank you. Well, I think last few minutes, we'll just have a nice wrap up and some closing comments from the panel. I heard on an earlier panel today at the Blockchain for Europe conference, somebody was discussing how in the world fairs of previous centuries, the organizers would try and get participants to tell us what lied ahead in the future. So I'm going to go around each of our panelists and pick on you to sort of give a nice little wrap-up overview of your personal view of where we see the future, specifically around blockchain evolution in everything we do, much like we saw 20 years ago with the birth of the internet and the first protocols coming into force. And who'd have ever thought we would just be using the web ubiquitous in our lives. Yeah, just really a crystal ball question, if I may. So anything goes here. Nobody's going to hold you to this. We're not going to watch this back in 10 years and say you're wrong. So let's start with Jens, please.
Yes, so I mean, from a personal point of view, I really wish that in general we will have more possibilities in the future to pay for things we buy with multiple currencies, right? Not restricted to the euro in Europe anymore, but also to have the chance to have other currencies. Also, in my opinion, also fine if you have other central bank digital currencies, stable coins or cryptocurrencies that we can use for payments. Really, I mean, regular stuff. If I go to the bakery or if I buy something online, I want to choose whatever fits best, and I don't want to just rely on the euro. That would be great, and also that the whole system in general gets much more decentralized. Really, that Europe has a chance in this environment to stay decentralized, that we have IT infrastructure that is really decentralized, providing services for these blockchains, and also that the players out there are more and more decentralized, right? That we not rely only on the big ones, but also that we have smaller players providing IT services for certain blockchains and solutions out there. So that would be my wish. That would be great.
Thank you, Jens. The same question to Caroline next, please. He's furiously writing away some good answers here.
Thanks, Ian. Look, I guess two things. One, I'd like us to have learned some of the lessons from the internet, particularly in terms of the impact of, network effects and kind of closed markets that arise and the lack of competition that we see, and think about how we can design, sort of at an architecture level, systems to ensure, ongoing consumer choice, increase competitive in the marketplace that allows, new entrants, new innovations to continue to evolve rather than kind of a first mover advantage, which sees sort of winner takes all. And I think secondly, and maybe a bit in contrast to Jens, I see a lot of the kind of innovations we're talking about in the DLT space really taking off in our online life. I see this growing bifurcation between our offline life and our digital world. And I think our digital world is only going to continue to grow and increase over time as whether it be, augmented and virtual reality and so forth, kind of many of the, spending more and more of our time and lives online. And it's in that online world where I see the greatest value add for a lot of the DLT based, particularly in the finance world, products kind of really having a role to play. Because although maybe our offline systems, the euro and so forth, maybe they have their problems, but they work pretty well. Where they don't work particularly well is being able to transfer value in our digital world in a really easy way. And I think so. I think that's where the kind of greatest opportunity is, and where we're going to see the kind of greatest growth in services.
Thank you, Caroline. Siddharth, why don't you have a bash as to your crystal ball moment?
I guess I don't have a crystal ball, but probably a wish list. As in, I would agree to some of the comments that Jens and Caroline made, like particularly more around like learning our lessons from Web 2, and then I believe like we want to believe that we are building the future of what we want to call as Web 3, and kind of building the trust within the protocol itself, right, which was lacking in Web 2 world. What that really enables is to kind of unlock new economic models and for really actually the offline world as well, but also enable new economic models for the online world, right? Like it will be remiss of us to say like Web 2 did not enable new economic models for the offline world, right? Like look at e-commerce, retail, taxis, anything. And we think there's a lot more innovation going to be unlocked when you inbuilt that trust model within the protocol itself, which is what we're kind of enabling. I do see that there'll be a plethora of innovation. Probably like we are at what, 1,200, 1,300, 1,500 cryptocurrencies, depending on how you want to count them. And the more legitimacy, the more mature the technology infrastructure, the more mature the regulatory environment, as well as the internet connectivity and adoption, I think probably the diversity is only going to grow, and the richness of services, the economic value add across the ecosystem, across industries, is only going to grow. So that's kind of my wish list.
Terrific. That's super interesting. Thank you, Siddharth. And Philip, your turn.
So I actually very much share the vision that Jens shared. So I'd really love to see, you know, cryptocurrencies adopted as a real alternative to fiat currencies, as a actual means of payment, you know, to bring cryptocurrencies from that nerdy tech niche and from that speculative object that it is currently to turn it and then to give it into the hands of, you know, ordinary average people, and to enable them to use cryptocurrencies just like they're using their MasterCard nowadays, right? And with the difference of actually being a very inclusive system that is accessible also, you know, to people and communities that right now don't have access to proper payment infrastructure and that are excluded from the global transfer of value. So I think that's actually where cryptocurrencies can really shine, and I hope that you know, people will see some of that happening in the future.
Well, thank you. It would be unfair for me to ask our four great panelists their view if I didn't give my own quick view before we finish up. Yeah, it's really difficult to forecast the future, especially around innovation. And you can read all the science fiction books you want to try and understand what a future looks like. Yeah, I always go back to when I first started using the internet and what the first use case, TCP/IP and email, and who'd have thought we'd be just living our whole lives using web-based technologies. But what I do know is that the horse has bolted, and the blockchain and crypto is here to stay. The rate of adoption has been exponential this last year. We can see that in the numbers, as I quoted before. So what I want is also not a crystal ball. I'll answer more, politically, is a wish list, and that is just really to finish on what we try and do at Crypto UK and Blockchain for Europe as advocates for the industry, is to seek that fair, balanced approach to regulation. And I see in lots of agencies we speak to, some levels of policymaking is driven by fear. Please, if I could urge anybody that's listening to engage with people in the industry, any of our panelists here that they're in the weeds building super interesting projects for the greater good of society, and that's where we see the people we work with and the stuff we do is reducing friction, increasing the benefits that technology brings to our lives. So on that little sum up, I will offer a massive thank you to our four panelists. Contact details will be shown later on, so if you want to reach out to any of us, please do so. Thank you so much, and back to our organisers.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.